very intimate audience here this evening, mostly due to exam pressure, hence why we're recording it for all of those students who have asked to come along, but then been subsequently pressurised into having to put their studies first. And I have to say, I think it's fantastic to see Hult students get together, decide what they want, and go out and get it. And I have to say, we actually should give you Viviane a big round of applause for getting this evening together. So thank you. And Hult Think Tank is why we're here this evening, and I'm sure you're going to get lots of positive thoughts and input, because it is actually with tremendous pleasure that I'm going to be introducing you to Ambassador Pinta Gama in a minute. But what I just want to tell you is some of the amazing things that this man has done, and he's given up his time to come and talk to you this evening. So, as the Brazilian Foreign Service, then actually Ambassador Pinta Gama has worked with humanitarian, environmental, science and technology issues, as well as transnational organised crime, illicit drugs, terrorism, trafficking of firearms, and money laundering. He's also been the Ministry's point of contact for intelligence, security and defence affairs. Of course, with the upcoming events, I'm sure you're a little disappointed I didn't have football on about this, but hey. But it's also not very often, because you're not here to hear me speak, but it's not very often that I get to introduce somebody who has been so honoured with so many awards and medals as this ambassador. He has a total of 11 medals and orders of honour from various different places. I could list them all.
Really? Didn't count.
I can do that later, but you're not here to speak and hear me, then actually you are here to welcome Ambassador Pinta Gama. He's going to come talk to you all about international organisation.
Thank you so much, Executive Director Rebecca Churchill. Thank you, Viviane, for the invitation to this Hult think tank. She was very persuasive, so I couldn't say no. And I'm glad I said yes, because this is a wonderful opportunity. I will speak about international organizations based in London. I will try to make a connection with what you do, with business and management issues. And first thing is that you may ask, what is the connection between diplomacy and business? I think it's very simple. We live in a rules-based society in which global governance is designed by international organizations. There are international negotiations that define these rules and procedures and regulations that will apply to all types of trade, of economic relations. So there is a very clear importance for business in what happens in international organizations. I was appointed 4 years ago a permanent representative to international organizations based in the UK, because since the 90s, actually before that, Brazil was represented by the embassy in London. But we decided that some of these organizations are so relevant that the bilateral ambassador, which means the one that is in charge of UK-Brazil relations, did not have the time, sufficient time, to go and to participate in these negotiations. So I was appointed to work directly with these international organizations here in London. When we talk about international organizations, people tend to think, oh yes, the United Nations. Of course, but the United Nations is not only a international organization, it's a family of organizations, it's a system. And within the UN system, you have different international bodies and agencies, specialized agencies, that are in charge of different subjects, different matters in relation to which are of particular interest to the international community. So I would mention only one of these specialized agencies that is based in London, which is the International Maritime Organization, IMO. So this is one example. But when you think about international organizations, of course, these are UN system organizations that are more of a political nature. But you have also organizations that are of an economic nature. And the main one is WTO, the World Trade Organization based in Geneva, that is in charge of all matters related to trade and all the international negotiations for trade liberalization and for tariffs and for all rules that have an impact on business, on our economies and our foreign trade. But there are also other economic organizations, and some of them are based here in London. So why I'm here, it's because London concentrates several international organizations. Beside the IMO, you have commodity-based organizations, such as the International Coffee Organization, the ICO, the International Sugar Organization, the ISO, the International Cocoa Organization, ICCO, and the International Grains Council, which was formerly the International Wheat Council, and then changed its name when it has incorporated soybeans and oil seeds. So that already provides a clear hint that how this is important for Brazil. Brazil is a major agriculture powerhouse. It's also an industrial country, but our strength lies very much on the huge size of our territory and the abundance of water, sun, and an agriculture that has been developed through the years. Is a tropical agriculture, and we manage in Brazil to develop the appropriate research for tropical agriculture. We have a company, the name is Embrapa, which is a research institution that is very specialized in tropical agriculture. So in 30, 40 years, it was very hard to have a strong economy, a strong agriculture in the tropics. It's not anymore the case. Embrapa did a lot of research and in these attempts, it succeeded to provide a very good technological basis for our agriculture. So you can say Brazil is, in terms of market share, is #1 in coffee, is #1 in sugar, also in meat, and then #2 or #3 in, let's say, soybeans, poultry, orange juice. So it's very likely that here in London, when you drink some coffee or you drink orange juice or you taste a good steak, it's very possible that you are consuming Brazilian products. So it was, of course, very, very important for us to participate in these organizations. I will maybe just one comment. The commodity-based organizations are here because London is the venue of important economic actors. You have the commodities stock exchange, you have traders, you have brokers, you have derivatives market. So everything is in London, and it makes sense that these organizations migrated to London. So we have here these commodity-based organizations that appeared more or less in the 60s and 70s. So they are relatively old. The coffee organization has just had its 50th, so 50-year anniversary for coffee, and the others are also relatively old. And in the beginning, the idea was to have more market intervention. So all the former agreements, commodities agreements, had economic clauses. So I remember, I heard, I wasn't here, but I heard there was a time where the countries, the coffee producers and the coffee consumers get together in London to discuss coffee price, and they stayed, I mean, days and nights discussing what should be the appropriate price for coffee, and then there was a huge impact on market, and everything was influenced by states. In the 90s, you didn't have that anymore. The economic clauses were all abandoned. My mission, this mission to the permanent, the mission of the permanent representatives to international organizations existed before. But in the 90s, when these economic clauses disappeared, there was a feeling that those organizations were not relevant anymore. But little by little, these organizations started to reinvent themselves and to find new ways and avenues to promote the interests of both producers and consumers. This is one characteristic, is that in these organizations you have two groups, the consumers and the producers. They have totally different interests. The consumers want, of course, full access to the commodity at the lowest possible price. And the producers want to value their production. They want prices that are fair, that are remunerative in the sense that provide enough income for them to reinvest, to continue to produce. It is also in the interests of consumers that this price should be fair, so that the market is stable. The problem with markets is that when markets is very unstable, then either you have producers that face a lot of difficulties, and that may lower the production, and then you have an impact on prices. Or you may, if you are a consumer, you may find that the coffee or the sugar you usually consume suddenly becomes very expensive. So these organizations are the place where you can have a dialogue between these two groups of countries in order to try to find what would be the fair price. It's very difficult. But where you can also try to focus on what are the needs of the producers. For example, financing. If you don't have financing, it's very difficult that you may increase your production. So how you can make financing happen in the commodity sector. For example, from the consumer's perspective, how you can make sure that the product is produced according to certain standards, such as environmental, social, and let's say the product is not is certified, which means that there was no child labor, that there was no deforestation. So it's a positive thing to certify these products. But from a producer's perspective, it's important that this certification provides a plus, provides an extra incentive to be certified and to get more income for this certification in order to strengthen the social and environmental aspects of the production. So it's a dialogue, it's a permanent dialogue between producers and consumers in all of these organizations. I will try to concentrate on some of these organizations, and I will try to leave aside political issues, but this is very theoretical because as we were discussing before, political and economic issues are interconnected. But let me go back to the International Maritime Organization. So the IMO was established in 1948. So 3 years after the establishment of the United Nations, the member states decided to have a specialized agency for shipping. It was important to provide maritime transportation to enhance international trade, and this maritime transportation, shipping, should follow some rules. So what would these rules be? The international organization decided, established and negotiated and established rules and regulations for international shipping. These rules and regulations have a direct impact on trade because they influence cost freights. The cost of transportation for a country like Brazil, which is far away from the consuming markets, Europe to start with, but China, which has become our main client for agricultural products, makes that any change in the cost of maritime freights for us can be a loss of competitivity. So we follow very closely all these negotiations because everything may have an impact on these costs. But mainly IMO is concerned about 3 levels of issues. One is safety. You heard 2 years ago, January 2012, the Costa Concordia accident capsized in Italy, and all the consequences that we have read in the press. So the IMO takes this accident and says, well, we should do something to prevent this to happen again. So it fully considers what happened. There is follows the police investigation and make recommendations and all that to strengthen the passenger ship industry, which is an important industry nowadays. More and more people go in cruises, so it's important, and the ships are bigger and bigger in size. It's amazing how the bigger ships are very, very big and take thousands of passengers. So safety is of paramount importance for the industry. If you have an accident, all the insurance consequences need to be dealt also. So it's important to prevent any kind of accident. Another level of attention for the IMO is security. Well, security, you may say it's political. It is. I mean, you are combating, for example, piracy in the high seas. You had a situation off the coast of Somalia in the Gulf of Aden that has improved after a lot of international coordination. Many navies sent ships to the area to patrol the zones, the zone. And now you have another focus of attention in the Gulf of Guinea. But it's not so much piracy, but it's more maybe theft with not so many ransoms like in Somalia. But again, piracy on both coasts of Africa. Before that, there was piracy in Asia. So it's a phenomenon that is global and that moves around. We need to pay attention. What is the economic impact of that? Of course, if you have piracy-infested areas, you have to adopt expensive measures like protecting your ship with armed guards, like making sure that the ships follow convoys. And all those measures have an impact, again, on the costs for transportation. Indirectly, it's also an economic matter. When I was saying something about safety of passengers, I forgot to say, there is also safety of cargo. A few years ago, we had, in 2009, we have some accidents with iron ore transportation from India, boats that capsized because iron ore liquefied. I myself never knew that iron ore could liquefy. I learned at the IMO, and there was a lot of concern on how to handle this issue, how to test. And the tests were not appropriate. And the problem for Brazil is that Brazil is a major iron ore producers together with Australia. The three main companies for iron ore are Vale in Brazil and BHP Billington and BHP Billington in Rio Tinto in Australia. So these three companies got together, and we did a lot of effort at the IMO to define what would be the best test to ensure that the transportation is safe, because we didn't want any other ship to capsize. The problem in Asia was more related to weather. There were the monsoons there, and it was very wet, and also the type of the cargo and the handling of the cargo. If you put iron ore a lot of time in rainy weather in the port, and you just put them in the bilges and in the vaults of the ships, of course, it may capsize because of the weight, because of too much water. So we needed to take precautions. This is an example of an issue of evident commercial and economic impact. And the other level of concern of IMO is environmental protection. And then you may say, oh, that's political again. But it's very economic in the sense that environmental protection means pollution. So pollution from oil spills, from human activities in general. Our seas are threatened by different factors, and one of them is oil pollution. But there is also the very sensitive issue of climate change. I mean, although shipping responds for only around 3%, a little bit more, of all CO2 emissions, global emissions, so it's relatively small. It's expanding, and with the increase in trade, we have a challenge to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases from ships. So how to do that? Do you tackle all ships from all destinations? But climate change is a phenomenon that happened because there were past emissions. You may go back to the Industrial Revolution in the UK and in developed countries. So there is, in the global negotiations on climate change, the idea that you have historic responsibilities that are in the developed countries. And you have the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, which means developing countries have responsibilities because they are common, but they are differentiated because they were not responsible for past emissions, because past emissions happen in developed countries. But the big emitters now have been joined by China. So there are emerging markets that are also high emitters now. China and the US are the main emitters. So it's a very tricky political negotiation, but it has a very clear impact. Whatever happens in terms of market-based measures, let's say a tax on fuel, on maritime transportation, on marine bunker fuels, any kind of measures like that would have a direct impact on developing countries, and especially on those that are far away from the consumer markets like Brazil. So we follow that very, very closely. And this is just an example of the economic importance of these organizations for us. I am responsible for 7 organizations. So there are, besides those that I mentioned, there are 2 small ones that I don't want to focus here, but one is on mobile satellites. The IMSO is the International Organization on Mobile Satellites. And this organization is important for the links and connections with monitoring ships at high seas. And it can also be instrumental in counter-piracy activities. But it's a smaller organization, and it's very much linked to the IMO. So in a way, it may be considered in conjunction with the IMO. And the other one is a very environmental organization, which is the IWC, the International Whaling Commission. Whaling is something that still happens. It sounds like something from the past, but the fact is that, as we have seen recently, Japan was condemned by the International Court of Justice. There was a ruling on whaling in the Antarctic. So it's a very important, interesting mechanism for preserving whales rather than killing them. But of course, it's a very old treaty from 1946, and at that time the concern was to hunt whales, but not to their extinction. Now there are a group of countries that it's bigger and bigger, and that those countries think that we should stop whaling and we should promote whale watching and non-lethal activities. But just to provide you an idea of how broad in scope my portfolio is, if I may, I don't know how much time I have, maybe 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. So if I go back to the commodities agreements, just some final comments, because I think those are the organizations that may interest you more closely. The ICO was, the coffee organization was established in 1963. And all executive directors of ICO were Brazilian, except for one Colombian. So that shows how Brazil has an interest in this organization. and how it was important in the past for price negotiation, for quotas, for stocks, but also how it is important now to promote an agenda of sustainability. I think sustainability is the word, is the key word in all economic activities. Everybody is looking for sustainable development. Member states of the United Nations get together, and they got together in Rio not long ago to discuss sustainable development. So we seek sustainability in all activities. Climate change is a concern for commodities as well. There are certain commodities that are already being affected by climate change. I could say that, for example, the rust leaf in Central America 2 years ago was caused mainly by differences in temperature and in weather related to climate change. So if you think sustainable, of course you think socially and economic sustainable, but you need to look at the environmental impacts on production, especially because when you see that the global negotiations on climate change seem to go nowhere. We didn't really have much progress, so countries need to be prepared, because I think we lack some ambition in our climate change targets, and the international negotiations are blocked. Although some individual countries are taking steps, there is no genuine international effort to address this issue. This is an issue for your generation, because you will have the impact of this, and the impact is still very, very difficult to predict, because every time the IPCC, the panel on climate change produces a report, there are contradictions, and so nobody knows exactly how we are going with this problem. But it's affecting the sustainability of our crops, and it may affect, and it may be a challenge to feed the country, to feed the planet in the future. So Brazil, I think, has a role to play in this challenge, because if you look at how land is available globally, you don't have much land now. Except for Africa, you don't have so much land in Asia, you don't have land at all in Europe. Everything is basically used. And in America, United States as well. So you have place to grow in Africa, and in Brazil you still have a lot, because without touching any tree, and we are conscious that deforestation is a problem in Brazil, but without expanding deforestation, you can use a lot of degraded pasture lands to increase your grain production. So when you think that you still may expand, but maybe 50% what we produce now, and that you may add productivity gains if you develop new technologies. I think we still have a very important role to play. If the necessary investment is made in Africa, of course Africa could also boost its production, and could also try to help feeding the planet. So one of the discussions we have is how to expand production in those countries. In terms of coffee, for example, as Brazil is the largest producer, you still have, well, we have countries like traditional players like Colombia that are still producing a lot of coffee, but you have new growers like Vietnam. Vietnam is growing very fast, and maybe some countries in Africa, like Ethiopia, which is the birthplace of the coffee plant. The coffee plant has been traveling around the world for many years, but there is a good prospect for growing more coffee in Africa. Sugar as well. And when I mean sugar, in Brazil, when you talk about sugar, you're also talking about ethanol. Our car fleet is now quite flex fuel in terms of using both gasoline and ethanol, we are trying to showcase our example, the attempt we make when producing when producing sugar is to associate sugar with ethanol production and also with cogeneration of electricity. So in small towns, you may have a sugar plant that produces both sugar and ethanol, and that also provides the necessary energy for this town. And this can be very useful in regions like Africa, where you have a shortage of energy, but an abundance of land and water and sun. So this is also a possibility to try to expand and to replicate our example in the sugar area to other regions. But for that, of course, we would need investment, and investment is not easy because it depends very much on the regulatory framework, which in many cases is non-existent or is very weak. So you have to discuss a global framework for these investments to happen. But Brazil has a very strong connection with Africa, is a player in Africa when we are trying to expand African agriculture production, not only sugar but also other types of products. And there are a lot of Brazilian companies that are looking for business opportunities in Africa. I think that all these issues of sugar, ethanol are connected with the energy crisis. When I mean energy crisis, I think we are experiencing different crises. We had the financial economic crisis. We have this environmental crisis with the threats of climate change and pollution that are rising, but we also have energy crisis. We need more energy. We need to provide energy to a large part of the global population, and this is quite it's quite a challenge. Energy is distributed in a very uneven way. Of course, in the oil era, you have the Middle East as as the main concern, but there are new oil activities, especially in offshore oil activities and ultra deep production, which is happening, for example, in Brazil in our pre-salt layer, which is very low. It's 7,000 meters beneath the ocean, and it's new production, and also there are new opportunities such as the oil and gas, shale oil, shale gas in the US, and this has also an impact on many countries and on the energy markets in general. But we think in Brazil that ethanol is not the only answer, but it's an important answer, because it reduces emissions, CO2 emissions, and it is economically sound, and can be combined with sugar production, for example, in order to provide for a more sustainable transportation. I think in other areas of agriculture production, I would say soybeans and maize, corn. Brazil is also expanding. It's a very huge producer, and that's why it's important for us to participate in the International Grains Council and all the discussions in relation to these commodities. So I think this provides more or less an overview of what I do and what the possible impacts and links with your own studies and activities. And I hope I will stop here and maybe try to respond to answer some questions. And thank you very much again for this opportunity and for the invitation.
Good evening. Ambassador Pinta Gama, it's a pleasure to have you here. It is what you said. You said about sustainability, which is what I was thinking of, and I'm so glad you mentioned. You might, as you're aware, you're in a business school, and I think it's fair to say there are many people thinking of investing in Brazil, looking at Brazil in a different way than people used to look at a couple of years ago. When you're talking about agriculture, Brazil has been exporting and using agriculture as its main economy boost for centuries, let's say 500 years. My question is, how long do you think that Brazil will be able to sustain its economy based on agriculture? And for investment point of view, is there any other industry that Brazil can rely on, or is totally rely on agriculture? Because as you said, climate change, it is a big issue we're facing now. And if you're talking about maybe relying on energy on its agriculture, is it maybe a dangerous or risky approach?
Well, thank you for your question. I think you have mentioned several issues there. Maybe to begin with the market perspective, it's always very hard to say, well, a country has problems because the press says this, or the experts say that. Of course, there are always short-term perceptions. There were changes, not only in Brazil, in many countries, but I think we should not forget the impact of China in global markets. For a country like Brazil, which is a strong agriculture powerhouse, China became very quickly our main client. So that means the US and Europe are less relevant. I don't think so, because we export more industrial goods to the US and to Europe than to China. So, of course, China was very important for the commodities boom that took place. But I would say that in the long term, there is a trend of increased food consumption in the developing world, in emerging markets, because you have a growing global middle class, and there is changing habits, there is consuming more. Of course, it will consume more industrial goods as well. But if you look at, for example, trends in the meat market, there are more people tasting a good steak in developing countries now than before. So you have a market expansion anyway, and you have climate change that affects producing countries. So we may have not an export boom, but we may have in the few years more price fluctuations because of the scarcity of some staples, because of these climatic effects. It's very hard to tell. But I agree with you that I think every country needs to have a strategy. It needs to concentrate on what it's best at. But at the same time, you cannot do only that. If you're good in agriculture, okay, you have to use this ability to export agricultural goods, to expand your income. But you have to diversify, and then you always fall into this question of whether government has or doesn't have a role to play in planning development, and then you have all the discussion on what priorities you should have. In Brazil, it's true that our agriculture is stronger. But if you look at some market niches like aviation, like Embraer, which is the top 3 aircraft producer after Boeing Airbus, Embraer has a very solid position, and it has developed itself almost alone from almost bankrupt company to a very large aircraft maker. So I think there needs to be some planning in order to allow for those companies to thrive, and in order to avoid over-dependence on commodities, for example, on China, for example. Dealing with China is not easy. I think the whole world is learning how to deal with such a big country that, I mean, can buy all the products you have and suddenly, I mean, may stop buying. And so it brings a lot of power to the table. And I think every country is learning how to deal with this new situation. But I think that if you forget what the market is saying now about Brazil, and if you look at what the market is looking in 5 or 10 years, it's very positive. Mm-hmm. All the assessments I read from banks, from specialists, say that Brazil in the long run will be quite okay. And of course, this is an election year. We'll have presidential elections in October. Many things may change, but not the fundamentals. I think if you look at the Brazilian politics, it has been somewhat stable, although it has changed hands, different political parties. But there is some kind of, I would say there is some kind of consensus over certain aspects. And I think inflation control is one of these aspects. And I think that a free exchange rate and fiscal responsibility, which means controlling your expenses. I think these three factors are kind of a consensus in our society. So whoever wins in October, I think we'll have to follow these patterns. And in the long run, I'm quite optimistic about our situation. But it's going to be difficult for everyone, and the threats and the challenges you mentioned are there for all of us to face, not only Brazil in any case.
Another question? Yeah, Viviane?
I have a question because you talked about ethanol and sustainable growth as well. But don't you think that there should be more investment regarding what's it called now? Oh my God.
Environmental for deforestation?
Infrastructure. Infrastructure. And because like Brazil is based, it's based pretty much on roads, and there's not much any other kind of transports. And for example, like when you go to the beach in Brazil, like if you drive from São Paulo down to the beach and Santos, the big port, and it's usually this huge line of trucks and waiting for them to load and stuff. So I think that this delays a lot of the growth that Brazil could have if they invested more in infrastructure. And my question is there any plan to invest more in infrastructure so that the country can grow as fast as it can?
Yeah, well, certainly there are plans. I wouldn't not connect so much the issue of investments in infrastructure with ethanol, because I think ethanol is a solution that is ready. In our thinking, it makes sense because Brazil had a very early anhydrous ethanol program. So that started in the 70s. So we built infrastructure for that. So all gas stations in Brazil have ethanol, and you can combine in your flex fuel cars. So our experience is a bit unique. When you think about ethanol for other countries, are you going to invest changing all your your petrol stations? And so it's a difficult decision. So it makes more sense for those countries that do not have an ethanol program to add ethanol to their gasoline, to improve the octanes and to reduce emissions. So for Europe, for the US, it makes sense to go for gasolines type E10, E15, those E something, which means mixed 10 or 15% with ethanol. I think the Brazilian case is very particular because we had this program, we had this infrastructure and all that. But on the general transportation infrastructure in general, I agree with you. And there is this program in Brazil for accelerating growth that is intended to improve infrastructures in all those areas. I agree it's a real problem for a major exporter like Brazil to have these queues of lorries waiting to load and load as we see when you have when it's crop season. means that we need to improve not only the roads, but also places where you can stock your product for some time and export throughout the year, for example, and not send all the production at the same time to the markets, to the international markets through our overcrowded ports. So it makes sense to invest, and people, and the government are investing. But this is an area where we still have a lot to improve. And I think we'll see that the improvements, important improvements in the next few years.
Ambassador, if you don't mind, I'd like to
Sure.
ask a question. About the regulation, you said that IMO that was created in 1948, which created regulations for shipping and traders. Do you possibly think that isn't it an excess of regulations where perhaps allow only big players to invest in Brazil, where it might be a bit more difficult for small companies it doesn't facilitate small companies to invest in Brazil, or excess of regulations that make Brazil a closed market rather than open market?
Yes, well, I think the first part of your question is the IMO. I think you need to realize that the IMO is perhaps regulating too much of international shipping, but I think this is necessary because you need to provide some safety and some assurances that lives will be protected, and that the products will be transported in a safe manner. So it's certainly a burden for developing, for smaller countries to follow these regulations, but I understand they are necessary. Our questions are more related to taxes, to other mechanisms that may impact on the transportation costs. And that happens because if you are a developing country, you still don't have a very strong shipping industry. So you have to rely on international shipping. And if you have added costs like a tax on bunker fuels, that will probably affect you more than other countries that are close to the internet, to their own markets, and that have a stronger shipping industry. Brazil, this is one area in which we are trying to expand, is the shipbuilding. Ship construction in Brazil was huge, was very strong until the 1980s, and it has dropped very much. So now we are trying to expand shipbuilding in Brazil, and there are clients like Vale, the mining company, and Petrobras, the oil company, that need a lot of ships for their activities, and we are trying to have part of these ships built in Brazil with international foreign investors, foreign shipbuilders from Korea, Japan, China, and others, Europeans, but building these new ships in Brazil. Our idea is to have, again, a stronger shipbuilding activity in the country. But I agree with you that regulations are sometimes a bit unfair for smaller countries, for developing and poorer countries. But I think you have to defend your interests. That's what international organizations are for. You have to participate in the negotiations and try to get a result that that can be absorbed by your own economy without much damage. Of course, for that it's very technical. You have to get to be ready, and you need a lot of study of these regulations in order to really participate. But it's the only way. Developed countries are very well prepared, and they are the proponents of the majority of these rules and regulations. So I think what we have been trying to do in the IMO, and mainly in the IMO here in London, was to strengthen the developing countries' position. What we also try to do in Geneva and New York, which is to defend our own proposals and interests. Otherwise, you just endorse an agenda that is not really yours. But it's up to diplomats to negotiate and to defend their country's interests. But sometimes it's very technical. You really have to dive into to really get involved and study all these matters in order to fully participate and to understand all the consequences of these regulations.
I have a question.
Sure.
You're talking about, if you don't mind, because of
No,
time.
not at all.
You're talking about the Brazilian investment in Africa. So if you think about external politics, we have the South-South cooperation. You think about cultural aspects. Brazil speaks the same language, the Portuguese, as many of African countries. If you think about economical aspects, we have Vale, which is a huge player in mining in Africa. But China is also a huge player in Africa. We're talking about late imperialism, colonization, or whatever. What is the dynamic of this relationship, of this competition between Brazil and China for the African market?
Well, I don't think there is a real competition. I think we are present, and the Chinese are very present. They have huge projects, huge investments. They have almost unlimited capacity to finance projects in Africa, and they have been doing a lot. I think what, well, we can talk of Brazilian way, which is perhaps a bit different. People tend to say that the Chinese, when they have huge projects in Africa, they bring their own workforce, and sometimes people say, oh, they don't use so much the local resources and personnel, etc. I think Brazilian companies in Africa tend to associate local people with their activities, and tend to look at the development side of the equation. I think it's not only for Portuguese-speaking countries, but I think Brazil has a very strong connection, historical and cultural connection with Africa. And I think if we consider our presence, the political presence we have in Africa, I can say that in the last 10 years we have opened 35 embassies in Africa alone. So that means that it's a big priority of our foreign policy, and companies, Brazilian companies are there, and some big companies like Vale have a strong presence in some of those countries, and I think it's in our interest to expand that. Giving two examples, in the coffee sector we have signed a memorandum of understanding to promote coffee production in Africa. This is, I mean, a show of generosity, because Brazil is already a main producer, but we would like to see more coffee being produced in countries in Africa, especially those that have the potential but have difficulties in establishing, in organizing their own markets. Some of those countries are coming from internal conflict, and may have some assistance. Some assistance would be important for them in that respect. In sugar, we have also been proposing a initiative for Africa to showcase our experience in sugar and ethanol. So I think it's not only the companies, but there is a strong priority by the Brazilian government to do that. But I don't see that as a competition. Africa has opportunities for any country that may be interested, but the fact is that the Chinese have a very strong presence. If you go to the African Union in Addis Ababa, all the African Union headquarters have been built by the Chinese, and that was a donation to the African Union. So this shows how powerful they can be in the continent, and of course that affects the position of not only Brazil, but I think mainly the traditional players in Africa, US, Europe. Now you may have more Brazilian presence, but you have also Chinese, Indian. India is quite present in Africa as well. So I think this is good news for Africa, because that provides more sources of funding and new projects for the continent.
I'm sure that's more than enough questions to move on to the other side. Are you going to say thank you?
Yeah, thank you very much for coming.
Welcome.
We very much appreciate everything that you said. It was very interesting. Thank you for everyone that came as well, and for the IT people that got to record this, for many other students to come to watch this. I'd like to invite you all to eat some Brazilian food and drinks outside. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In preparation for tomorrow's game, right?